Thank you. Welcome everybody to the Climate Action Fair and to our first speaker of the day. This is Food Choices and Global Warming, and our presenter is Dr. Peter Spendelow, who is a senior researcher at Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. He's a former president of Northwest Veg, which is a nonprofit organization dedicated to bringing awareness to the power of a plant-based vegan lifestyle and helping support people in their transition towards making healthier, more sustainable, and compassionate food choices. And it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Spendelow.
Thank you. Just a little bit background about me. I've been at the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality in what we call our materials management section now for almost 39 years. So it's a little bit of work. I have a PhD in zoology, but I've really gotten interested in this aspect in particular. So let me just start out by giving you a statement here. Food obviously is very important to us, but what people don't realize is the huge impact that the growing of food has on the environment. In many ways, the growing food to feed 8 billion people has the most impact on the environment of anything that humans do. Here's a little outline of what I want to talk about is how large is this impact? Why does animal agriculture in particular have such a large impact? I want to talk a little bit about the biology of animal agriculture. And then finally end up with some powerful steps to reduce greenhouse gases and protect the environment that we all can do. Now, again, I work for the Department of Environmental Quality, and of course we have a lot more things than just materials management. We have a lot of issues. We look at global warming, habitat loss, water pollution, air pollution, conservation of energy, a lot of toxins, what goes on in our ocean. There are a lot of things that we deal with. And food production is really important for all of these. In many of these, it's the most important factor of how we impact the environment, or in some cases, might not be the most important, but it's really far up the list. And let's talk a little bit about habitat to begin with, and just how huge the impact of food production is. This is a table showing all the land use, excluding Antarctica and inland waters, all the land use, how it's used. And as you can see here, agriculture takes up 37% of the Earth's land surface. 37%. Forests are 31%, and barren areas would be deserts and cities and so on, which is almost entirely the deserts in that aspect. Cities are not that big. Make up about 32%. But if you look at that agriculture, 67% of that is pasture, and then another 29% is crops. But a lot of those crops are used not for human consumption, but instead used for animal food. And to give you an idea here in the United States, 73% of the food that we grow is not grown for human consumption. It's grown either for animal feed or a smaller amount used for biofuels. So 73% of the food we grow is not being used to feed humans. Quick question here. Let's just see if we can. Of all the crops we grow in Oregon, in terms of the number of square miles or whatever units you want to call, what is the crop that takes up the most land area in Oregon that we grow? Any guesses? I heard wheat.
Grass seed.
Grass seed, that's a good guess.
Corn.
Corn? No. The answer is hay. Hay. Hay and alfalfa. Anybody here eat hay? So wheat is a second close. I mean, it's really close to the same, but and grass seed is third, by the way. So you pick the good ones there. So again, huge impacts there. Let's talk about water. 70% of the water withdrawals, where you pull water out of a river in the world, are used for irrigation. And then this is an interesting statistic, and this is coming from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. They say a kilogram of beef takes up to 15 tons of water to produce.
Whoa.
15 tons, that is a lot of water. There's a study that just came out in March, looked at the Colorado River for 20 years, from 2000 to 2019, and looked at all the water withdrawals. So leaving out the water that evaporates from the reservoirs and that sort of aspect, just looking at the water we pull out of the river, 46%, remember where this is. This is the Colorado River, really dry area, you know, Arizona and so on. 46% of it is being used to raise alfalfa and hay. 46% of the water you pull out. Whereas cities, for industrial use, for commercial use, for drinking water, cities are only 26%. So again, you see the impact that agriculture is having we pull out so much water from the Colorado River that most times it doesn't even reach the ocean anymore. It dries up before it gets to the ocean. So just absolutely huge impacts there. Water pollution. You know, we hear about we have like a manure lagoon that breaches and all the manure pours in the river and kills all the fish. But the real issue with agriculture is not that, you know, those big events, but just the continual, what we call eutrophication, where all the fertilizer we use gets washed into the rivers and it creates bacterial blooms and algae blooms and does things. You know, we've seen the amount of fertilizer absolutely hugely increase in the last, 70 years or so. And here's a map showing the Mississippi River basin. And the areas which are shown in red there are areas which are highly productive agricultural areas, but most of the food being grown there is not being grown for human consumption. It's being grown, again, for animal feed. And so you see a huge area of red there. And then down here at the bottom, you'll see this little purple stain. What this is from, this happens every year, by the way, but this is particularly from 1999, where I pulled this table from. That is the hypoxic zone. And what a hypoxic zone is, again, you have all those fertilizers washing into the river, growth of bacteria. The bacteria use up all the oxygen. And what do you end up with? You end up, you know, how can fish live when there's no oxygen? How can crabs live where there's no oxygen? So you get this huge thing. Now, back a number of years ago, there was a huge oil blowout down here in the Gulf, and that made news, you know, day after day. It was just huge news. But this happens every year, and it's bigger than this. And again, you know, it's agricultural hope that's doing it, but again, most of that agriculture is not being used to feed us. It's being used to feed animals that we eat. Now I'm going to do one last thing here on a big issue, which is the oceans, and what we do to the oceans. A major study done back a number of years ago determined that of all the large predatory fish, the total biomass of large predatory fish is now only about 10% of what it was in pre-industrial levels. If you look at the sort of resources we put out there to do fishing, I mean, fish have no chance with all the fancy equipment that they have to locate where the fish are and the long lines and the nets and so on to scoop them up. In this case, you see, this is a fish called menhaden. And what happens to those fish after we suck them up? Well, of course, they die on the boat. There's no humane slaughter. They suffocate. But what do we use them for? They used to be used just for fertilizer. Now they're used mainly for fish food. It's called a reduction fishery. We haul up all these fish, and we put them through a process to make fish meal. Then we feed fish in the agriculture environment, or we feed to cows, or we feed to chickens. That's what happens to these fish. Maybe a little bit of it goes into making omega-3 fatty acids for supplements or something like that, fish oil, but very, very little of this fish is used for human consumption. And what happens when you pull these out? Of course, that's another reason why we don't have as many large predatory fish, is because we pull all their prey fish out. Okay, I got another question for all you, just to show the domination. Let's talk only about mammals for the moment and ask a question: which species of mammals has the most biomass of all the whales, kangaroos, horses, rhinoceroses, elephants, deer. Of all the mammals, what species do you think has the most biomass? Any guesses? Mammals.
Cows.
Okay. Anybody who's thinking humans, you're close. This is the biomass of humans. How if you look at all the wild mammals, not the domesticated ones, so not the horses and sheep and cows and so on, and pigs and dogs and cats, but look at all the wild mammals. Where do you think they rank? Add them all together. And this is what's shocking. That's where they are. They're only about 3% of the total biomass of all the mammals. But we didn't hit the species with the most yet. So, what do you think that is? Cows. Cows. That's the species with the most. And then if you look at all the pigs and horses and dogs and cats and the domesticated mammals, they're up there too. So you can just see the domination that we have of the world, in terms of the number of mammals out there and so on. Well, let's just switch over here. I want to get to the greenhouse gas aspect, but I want to just explain a little bit about, this is really going back to your high school and earlier days, basic food chain ecology. When mammals like us, or any animals, eat, we use most of the energy not for growth, but simply in our living, keeping our bodies warm, walking around, doing that sort of thing. A friend of mine commented about how I've lost weight recently. I obviously wouldn't be a good food animal because, everything I eat just doesn't add to my mass, doesn't make more food for anybody. And that's true for, again, growth is growth of the animals and reproduction. Only about 10% on average, and this is a very crude number, only about 10% of the energy that animals eat actually goes into growth. 90% of it goes into just their day-to-day living. And so as you go up the food chain, you get less and less biomass because you just don't have all that much energy to support that. So the point I want to make is that 10% issue. And if you look at food animals, this is a if you look at food animals, they some of them are really pretty inefficient. Cows in particular. And by the way, as an ecologist, I know that the unit measure out there for the best unit measure is calories, the amount of energy that animals eat. Animals eat energy. We, for instance, really don't need to concentrate on protein because we get plenty, even as vegans, get plenty of protein. It's really calories that is in short supply out there in the natural world. And if you look at this, take chickens for example. This is again a slide from Drawdown, which is a great organization. According to them, and this is lower than I thought it was, only about 12% of the calories that chickens take in is converted into chicken meat that we can eat. A lot goes into feathers and so on, but a lot of it just goes into their living. What this means, even if it was 33%, which is the figure I used to be using, it means that you're feeding them corn and things that we can eat, and you're only getting a small amount back out of it. You're just throwing the rest away. We wouldn't need all that land, we wouldn't need all that fertilizer if we ate the corn and the other grains and so on directly ourselves, as opposed to putting them through animals. And again, cows are really inefficient. Pigs are not so efficient, but they're more efficient than cows are. So that's just some really basic things to understand a little bit here now to talk about global warming. And the thing that really brought this to the public's attention was, because I don't think people really thought about it much before, was in 2006, the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization came out with a major study. This is hundreds of pages long, lots of data, called Livestock's Long Shadow. And these are a couple of quotes from the executive summary of that. The livestock sector is by far the single largest anthropogenic user of land. Anthropogenic means human-related. In all, livestock production accounts for 70% of all agricultural land and 30% of the land surface of the planet. this is the one that really shocked people. Regarding greenhouse gases, the livestock sector is a major player responsible for 18% of greenhouse gas emissions as measured in CO2 equivalent. This is a higher share than transport. On a worldwide basis, they're saying it's a higher share than all of the cars, planes, trains, and boats that we use for transport. Now, since then, they've revised this down a little bit to about 14%, which puts it about on par with transport, which is also about 14%. But there have been many other studies that have looked at it and come up with different figures. And on the short term, it is really important. I'll get to why on the next slide, actually, which is, why does animal agriculture have such an impact? Well, there are 4 factors that, one of us, when we all think of when we think of climate, which is carbon dioxide. And you have tractors that are used out there in agriculture, and you're having to ship. But interesting, by most of the transportation associated with animal agriculture is not taking the animals to market. It's taking food to the animals. That's where it's all that hay, which is harvested in one place and then taken to where the cattle are in some other place. A lot of that hay that's grown in Oregon is, I believe, shipped over to China, for instance. So that's where a lot of this is. But of these 4 factors, that's the least important. The much more important is a greenhouse gas called methane, which is about, well, on a 100-year time scale, it's about 20 times, no, about 30 times more potent than carbon dioxide. On the 20-year time frame, it's somewhere in the order of 80 to 100 times more potent. And how does that match into animal agriculture? It's because cows can eat food that we don't. They can eat grass and hay. They can't digest that directly. Instead, they have a section of their stomach called the rumen, where all this gets packed in, and bacteria go to work on it, and they digest the cellulose in that hay. But being packed in there, they use up all the oxygen. So the type of bacteria that live there are anaerobic bacteria. They're ones that will eat up the cellulose, and they produce a byproduct of methane. About 8% of the energy going into a cow will come out as methane gas, which again is a very potent greenhouse gas. Another major factor, though, is all the fertilizer we use. Fertilizer releases nitrous oxide to the atmosphere, and nitrous oxide is a molecule, even though it's not very much of it, is 300 times more potent than carbon dioxide is, and so it has a huge impact. But what they determined, and what Project Drawdown, those of you familiar with it, have also determined, is the largest impact is the impact on tropical forests and the deforestation which is going on in tropical forests throughout the world, mainly for creating grazing land and for growing more crops to feed animals. And the next slide shows the sort of thing I'm talking about here, with where they'll use fire to clear out areas, which of course releases a lot of carbon dioxide. The exposure of the land will release carbon dioxide from the soil as the sunlight penetrates it. You can see the false color slide here of how agriculture has gone into the Amazon. So, again, huge tropical forest loss over the last years. Now here's a study that we being Oregon Department of Environmental Quality did. I wasn't even involved in this study, but our life cycle people did it. What they wanted to look at, it was a study actually on food packaging and what sort of impact food packaging has. But I'm showing this graph here because it really shows something that people would not expect. There's so much interest in plastic and food packaging now, but the packaging is only, the little green bars on this graph. This is showing the amount of carbon dioxide equivalents per pound of product.
Wow.
And the packaging is only the little green bar. The processing of food, which is the cooking and so on, is that orange bar. What's the huge thing? It's the production of the food. It's the growing of the crops or the growing of the animals. And if you look at how huge these bars are, but you notice a little pattern here. The long bars are meat, fish and seafood, and dairy. The short bars are vegetables, legumes and nuts, fruits, cereals and grains, and beverages. You're talking here about order of magnitude differences between the energy and the greenhouse gases that go into production of meats versus the productions of grains and legumes and foods like that. With legumes, by the way, have plenty of protein. If we did this on a protein basis, the graph would come out pretty similar, except the beverages would be way down. Anyway, so I'm running out of time, but I just want to quickly cover a huge other thing, which is food waste. According to the USDA, we waste about 30 to 40% of the food that we grow for human consumption. And I know this because, by the way, when you waste that food, of course, you waste all the energy and all the fertilizer and everything that went into producing that. And I know this because as part of my work at DEQ, I do our waste composition studies. I figure out what people throw away. We actually go out there and grab samples out of garbage trucks and self-haul vehicles and drop boxes and all this. We have a crew that sorts it. We figure it out. And the material that is highest in our garbage cans is food. In our household garbage cans, it's about 25% of the weight of what we put in garbage cans is food. Now, not all of that is edible food, but about close to 15% of it is, and about 10% is the husks and shells and things like that. So we throw away a lot of good food. And I'm looking overall, it's about 16% of our total waste stream. Household garbage, it's even higher. Now, I just want to now drop back to, I mentioned Project Drawdown. How many people are familiar with that organization? Hopefully a lot are. It's a nonprofit organization that looks at what is needed to reduce greenhouse gases. How can we draw down the carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere? A very good organization. They've studied 93 different possible things, solutions, to figure out how important they are. And if you look at their solutions, the number 1 and number 2 are both agriculture related. Number 1, this is for their scenario 1. Number 1 being reduce food waste. And right up there, right next to it, is plant-rich diets. Not even vegan diets, just plant-rich diets. So again, huge impacts that you can make by reducing the food. I'm almost out of time. I'll just jump ahead to 2 slides I wanted to show you. Again, this is a slide showing greenhouse gases for consumed foods, but it's breaking them out into more categories. And you can see a real break here, right there. Everything on this side is animal products. Because it's done based on weight, everything on this side is plant-based products with one exception of milk. And that milk's up there because, way down here, because milk is mainly water. If you concentrated it down to things like what's in plants or meat and so on, it would be. It would be more like where eggs are. So, again, but if you'll see the huge one here are the ruminants, the one that has the ruminants, the lamb and beef. But if you think the message I want is you should switch from beef to chicken, that's not the message I want to get, because I want to consider one other really important thing, important to me at least, and that is how we treat our animals. How these are sentient beings. Chickens, for instance, they're social creatures. They have language. They can talk to each other. They're just amazing birds. Birds in general are amazing. If anybody knows what crows can do and parrots and so on. But this shows how many animals get killed for producing 1 million calories. 1 million calories is about what we eat. And the red is the actual slaughter, and the yellow is the animals that die based on harvest, based on things like tractors running over them and stuff like that. And you can see the 2 biggest ones there are chickens and eggs. Why are eggs so large? Well, a hen only produces about 300 eggs or so in its whole lifetime, which is just amazing that they do that. It's really hard on them. But of course, every male chick that's born that's for an egg-laying hen gets slaughtered immediately because they're worthless. They don't grow fast enough for meat, and they don't produce eggs. So, whereas beef and so on, it's much lower animals being killed. Of course, all the plant-based ones, there's a little bit of loss from harvest, but not much from the not any slaughter, obviously. This is where eggs come from, most of them still. We're getting to where they're now being produced just in large open barns, but still most of the eggs here are produced in this sort of thing, which these birds get put in there when they are really young, and that's their whole life, is like this. if about a year and a half, they become what is called spent hens. You see how ragged these birds are. That's because they're living there with like 6 or 7 birds. It's something about the size of a microwave. It's really horrible. And why do we stop at the species barrier and we're looking at equity? I mean, these are sentient beings. These are beings that care about, what their living conditions. So, I got to jump on because I'm out of time. I was just going to end with, if we would reduce our meat consumption, we could, for instance, revert 10 million square miles of land back to nature. Allow some of those wild animals to exist, and trees and shrubs would soak up all that carbon dioxide. And even we could reduce our croplands significantly, because again, most of the croplands are being used. So with that, I just wanted to say, this is the solutions. If you want to reduce your environmental impact, the number one thing you can do is eat low on the food chain. And number 2 is don't waste food. And other things like eating organic and seasonal are important. Eating local and somewhat important. And composting is somewhat important. But I mean, those first 2 are the huge things you can do to reduce your impact. It's eat low on the food chain and don't waste food. So with that, I run out of time. I know we have another speaker speaking in another minute. Any last questions? Anything? Okay.
Check out the Thursday North and Veg. One of the tables out there. How do you more plant-based food?
Okay. And I've got some handouts over here. If anybody wants to, have some of the slides that I've showed up here. If anybody wants that. And again, I'll be back at the Northwest Veg table. I welcome anybody to come and talk to me about any of this. This is something that I've been working on for many years. This is about quite close to the 100th time I've given a talk like this.
Three amazing presenters who are so knowledgeable about our forests. And our first speaker is going to be Paul Koberstein, and he is the author of the book Canopy of Titans. He has a booth. You can buy the book, and you can have him sign it. It's a great gift book. It's a page turner. And I can't recommend it highly enough. After Paul talks, we'll then have 2 amazing climate activists, Brenna Bell and Chuck Willer, and I'll introduce them after Paul is done. So Paul is, just a few words about Paul. He is the editor of Cascadia Times, which is an environmental journal from the Cascade bioregion. He founded this in 1995. He was previously a staff writer for the Oregonian and the Willamette Week. In 2004, he won the John B. Oakes Award for the most distinguished environmental journalism in the United States. In 2016, he won the Bruce Baer Award, given annually to an Oregon journalist for excellence in investigative journalism. His new book, Canopy of Titans, pulls together decades of research and writing about our temperate North American rainforest, which stretches from the California redwoods to Alaska. After giving the reader an overview of forests and climate, he zeroes in on our Oregon forests and our dwindling keystone species and why that is. He moves on to cover the historical and ongoing theft of Native American lands, the story of Alaska forests and greenwashing. His book is a tremendous resource. It's beautifully written, and I and others that I've recommended it to couldn't put it down. He begins his book with the Wendell Berry quote: "The care of the earth is our most ancient and worthy, and after all, our most pleasing responsibility. To cherish what remains of it and to foster its renewal is our only legitimate hope. So I want to introduce you to Paul Koverstein.
Happy Earth Day, everybody, and welcome to our program. I want to start by just acknowledging that these lands are, I'm sorry, is that on? Thank you. I want to acknowledge that these lands we are living on are native indigenous lands that were 67 different linguistic groups went down throughout this rainforest, and today we're losing many of them as we are losing the forest. I want to start off by talking about not about the forest, but about coal. You may have noticed this week, I saw an article in the New York Times that the Biden administration has decided to cut back coal emissions by 90% by the year 2032, which is great. We need to stop burning fossil fuels. But if that's all we do, we won't get to where we need to go. There are about 300 gigatons of carbon dioxide in the air, and this is the pollution that is causing global warming and all the effects we're having with melting glaciers, falling ice shelves, and wildfires and all those things, heat domes. This week, I was watching the news, obviously. It was ads by the timber industry that they brag about. When they cut down one tree, they plant 3 more. Problem is that replacing 4 feet with 4 inches, these young trees will probably never really begin to replace the trees that are cut down. They'll be harvested probably in another 20 or 30 years. And sorry, I'm losing my place. But my point is that tree planting won't do the job either. We have, there's a Chinese proverb that says the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. The next best time is today. We are saying that the best time to plant a tree is 100, 150 years ago. And the best thing that you can do today is save a tree. Now I want to read from chapter 2 of our book. Chapter 2, entitled Too Good to Be True. In 2007, Richard Branson, the British entrepreneur, offered a $25 million prize for anyone inventing a device capable of removing lots of carbon dioxide from the air. Andy Kerr, the noted Oregon environmentalist and author, drew a picture of a tree and sent it in. But he didn't win, foiled by the contest rules that said the winner has to be the inventor of that device. True, Kerr didn't invent the tree, but he had a point. Through the process of photosynthesis, that's a nice word to say, trees inhale carbon dioxide, one of the greenhouse gases behind the rise in global temperatures. CO2 is 1 part carbon and 2 part oxygen. The tree is about 1/2 carbon. They retain the carbon to make glucose and recycle the oxygen back into the air. The living and dead trees, along with forest soils, hold the equivalent of about 80% of all the carbon currently in the atmosphere. If there's one thing the planet has in abundance, it's trees. A study in 2015 by Timothy Crowther of Yale University counted 3 trillion trees, or about 422 for each person. Without trees, life would be difficult, if not impossible. Trees are a source of food, medicine, fuel, shelter, and recreation for billions of people. In the Pacific Coast, trees freshen the air with their signature scents of fir, pine, spruce, and cedar. They stabilize soils, retain moisture, and filter pollution from the air and water. They cast a cooling shade over streams that are home to millions of salmon. The salmon return the favor by bringing back nutrients in the ocean in an ecological feedback loop. The tree's most important task, however, may be removing carbon from the atmosphere, but it's not something that one tree does all alone. The clusters of trees we call forests perform this service on a massive scale, free of charge, without complaint. They are carbon capturing machines. Canopy of Giants is about two themes. One is this great big rainforest we have along the Pacific coast that, as Harris said, stretches from the redwoods to the Tongass in Alaska. But it's also about what these trees are doing for the climate. They are, if we don't cut them down, they will be absorbing carbon and stabilizing the climate. There are three strategies basically that can be done with trees to help improve climate. Don't cut them down. Don't cut down the old growth. Don't cut down the mature trees, which are trees 80 to 150 years old or so. And these trees are absorbing carbon rapidly. The younger trees, the tree farms, not so much. But you can also do something with those trees. You can extend the rotations, cut them down less often, let them continue to grow until they become larger. We started Canopy of Giants, talking about my newspaper, in 2018 on a trip to the Tongass. My co-author and I, Jessica Applegate, we noticed that in the literature, the scientific literature, there have been discussions of forest carbon and how protecting trees can as it says, stabilize the climate. But no one was talking about it, especially the Forest Service. At the time, the Forest Service was contemplating the idea of cutting down trees in the roadless areas of the Tongass, which would have had a huge impact on the environment, on the climate. But the Forest Service did not even recognize that. There was no discussion of the climate impacts of the logging. And we thought that was really, really odd. And we started talking around, and people weren't really aware of this. The environmental community was really focused on other things that the forests were doing, habitat for biodiversity. We thought the climate should be part of that discussion. And so we decided to look into it. And the first thing we decided, we noticed that this rainforest along our coast didn't have a name. I called the author of the Oregon Atlas at the University of Oregon, and he said, well, that's a good question. I really don't have a good answer for you. And the guy at Portland State we talked to said it's not even on the National Register of Place Names. And we think that a forest, or anything that you love, to protect it, we really need to name it. We call it in our preface the Amazon of the North. We have other names too, but there's no name you can stick on a poster and say, save this forest. And I think that should be one of the things that we do, is figure out a name for this rainforest. Our book is about trees, but it's not only about trees. We write a lot about salmon. We were stunned to find that the salmon, protecting salmon, is also a climate strategy. The one scientist we talked to did a study that found that trees that grow close to a salmon spawning stream grow 3 times faster than trees further away, which means that protecting salmon is absolutely necessary as well. Beaver, salmon in the estuary, beaver create habitat for the salmon, prevent them from going to the ocean too soon before their bodies are ready. And then when they come back, there's been a beaver in their early life history. They survive 3 times greater. So protecting beaver is also essential. And it's interesting to note that in the state, there is an annual beaver hunt sponsored by the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. There's been a call by environmentalists to stop that. A professor at Oregon State University, Boone Kaufman, said that stopping the beaver hunt is probably the most cost-effective climate mitigation strategy you can find. The indigenous people of this region and their stories directly tied to the forest, and their cultural burning and salmon, and we really respect that. We found that in British Columbia, we spent a lot of time writing about British Columbia. British Columbia, the First Nations up there, their indigenous rights have long been denied, and they're trying to also recover their trees and their salmon. And the last thing I want to talk about, though, is the science of forest carbon. 30 years ago, there was really no scientific literature about how trees can absorb carbon and how much they do. Mark Harmon, a professor of ecology at Oregon State, discovered that the old-growth forest that had been cut down over the previous 30 or 40 years, about 1 gigaton of carbon had been lost over that time, well, the 20th century. Since then, scientists have come to realize that the Douglas fir has about 1,200 tons of carbon per acre, which is an amazing amount, about 4 times as much as in the Amazon. You hear the Amazon being described as the lungs of the earth. These forests are definitely the lungs of the earth. If you go further south, the redwoods, those forests are 10 to 15 times more dense with carbon than the Amazon. And we are cutting down redwoods as well as Douglas fir. In 2016, a professor at Humboldt State University, Steve Sillett, discovered that the redwoods and Jedediah Smith State Park in Northern California are the most carbon-dense forests in the world. And the Douglas fir region is not far behind. The only place else in the world that rivals this are the eucalyptus stands in southern Australia. So what we know from this data is we know where we can cut. We want to minimize the damage to the climate, and which forests to protect. We want to protect the climate. Thank you. And if you are interested in seeing my book, I'll sign it for you afterwards. We're way over in the corner.
What's the name of it?
Canopy of Titans.
Thank you, Paul. I want to lift up a couple other things in your book that I really appreciated. Not only does he cover the science and the ecology of these forests and the historical ways that they have been destroyed for the last 150 years, but he also talks about the misinformation, the way that the timber industries have these really lovely sounding names that make you think that they're all about, protection. And not only do they give misinformation about which trees sequester the most carbon, but they also attack ecologists who, and I really appreciated these stories, these amazing ecologists that are working in the universities who are attacked by the timber industries, they've tried to silence them, and they're like, no way. And I really appreciate the way that you told their stories, and it reminds me that all of us need to be, learning the kind of stuff that's in here and be the voice for this, and writing letters to the editor, talking to our legislators, and so forth. So, thanks again for all the effort that went into the research and writing this book. Next, I'm going to introduce two more Oregon forest protectors, Brenna Bell and Chuck Willer. And they're going to speak to us and answer questions about what can we do right now to help Oregon forests. Brenna, she, her, is currently the Forest Climate Manager for 350 PDX and co-founder of the Pacific Northwest Forest Climate Alliance. At 350 PDX, she works on state forest policy and shade equity within the Portland urban area. Brenna's been a longtime forest activist and environmental attorney, working with the Cascadia Forest Alliance, KS Wild, and Willamette Riverkeeper. For over 10 years, she led the Mount Hood Forest Protection Organization, BARC, as an advocate, educator, attorney, organizer, and friend to the forests surrounding Mount Hood. Through her journey, Brenna's understanding of what it means to save the forest has changed. After years of wins and losses in fights over specific groves of big old trees, her vision has grown to see the forest as the whole web of relationships that sustains life on Earth. She's written, "Defending that web requires transforming our entire relationship with the land, personal and cultural. This means reckoning with the damage of colonialism and genocide of indigenous peoples and their lifeways." While working with BARC, Brenna also helped focus on issues at the intersection of forest management and climate change. She's a Southwest Hills neighbor living with 20 others at Tryon Life Community Farm, which is tucked into Tryon Creek State Park. So let's give a hand for Brenna.
Did you crib from my farewell email from BARC? That was great. Hi, everyone. It is my pleasure to be here. Harriet invited me. I don't know what your introduction to yourself was like, but I'm going to just return the favor a little bit by saying Harriet is one of the most wonderfully committed volunteers that we work with at 350 PDX, and shows up for people, shows up for protests, shows up to testify, and has gifted our entire forest defense team a plant, now named Harriet, that moves between team members and has brought enormous joy, as you do yourself. So yeah, with that, I'll just speak a little bit about, I missed you, Paul, I'm sorry. So I don't know how much you talked about forests and climate, but I'm guessing it was a lot. But I'm still going to go into my points. I apologize in advance if I'm being repetitive. I want to talk about three main things that we focus on with the 350 PDX Forest Defense Team and my work with the Pacific Northwest Forest Climate Alliance. Three things that moved me from just focusing on forests, because that's kind of what I grew up with and in, was the conservation movement. They were like, big trees are great, spotted owls are cool, clean water and salmon. I still believe all these things very deeply. But we also noticed what we were doing was saving place by place by place, fighting to just save specific places for specific species, while the entire time there was this slow-moving disaster coming called climate change. And the conservation movement wasn't very involved in climate discussions until fairly recently, about the last 10 years, when the science has said, forest people, the forests have a huge role here. And the way we're managing them is counterintuitive to moving that role forward. So what's their role? As you said, they're amazing at storing carbon, right? So our organization is called 350 PDX. Does anyone know where the number 350 comes from? Yeah.
This is...
Exactly, it's a question. This is my question.
Well, it was once the goal of how many parts per million of carbon dioxide we would limit ourselves to.
That's right. And why 350 parts per million?
Could you repeat that, please? Could you repeat the answer?
Yeah, the answer is it was the goal of how many parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere we should be limited to. Why? Well, you know. We were just talking, somebody else.
That limited the amount of global warming to like 1.5 or 2 degrees.
Exactly. 350 parts per million was the part that we thought this is, the limit with which we'll not see global climate collapse or catastrophe. Right? 350 parts per million. Second question. Anyone know where we're at now?
4.25.
420. Yeah. So we've got 420 parts per million. We're supposed to have 350. So what do we need to do? Get it down, draw it down. And there's all these people who are like, let's have tech and draw it down. And maybe some of that'll work. But do you know what's really, really, really good at getting carbon out of the atmosphere? Trees. Big trees, even small trees. Like all trees are really good because what they do is they draw the carbon down, they turn it into tree. Right? That's where it goes. It becomes tree. It becomes roots. It goes into the soil. It becomes trunk. It becomes leaves. All that carbon is becoming tree. And once it's tree, it's stored. It's stable. So that is the first thing we focus on doing is keeping the carbon in the trees. So the second thing, just closely related, is decreasing all sources of carbon emissions. Right? So people often think of decreasing carbon emissions as stopping fossil fuels. True, that's great, but land management has a huge impact on carbon emissions. And even before we started using the fossil fuels that we do, we were changing the climate through land management, mostly due to massive colonial expansion. And one of those things was cutting forests. And we're still cutting forests. And all of that stored carbon, it doesn't all disappear immediately, but when it's no longer in the tree, it becomes unstable, right? So some of it, gets burned because when they burn the slash. Some of it decomposes really quickly because it's no longer attached to tree. The stuff in the soil degrades and releases all that carbon. And so the way we've approached industrial forestry has released immense amount of carbon. In fact, it's one of Oregon's top carbon polluters is forest management. So we have this thing, right, that could be the best way the Pacific Northwest can contribute to the climate movement, our trees, and instead we're cutting them and contributing to more carbon in the atmosphere. So that's stupid. And one of the reasons that the forest movement has started really considering the climate justice movement as the place we should be focused on. And some climate people recognize that too. But there's a third thing that forests do that is really, really helpful to all of the beings, including humans, who rely on them. And that is increase our resilience to a changing climate. And I'm talking about kind of multiple types of forests here, both the forest that we think about like state forests and federal forests, but also urban forests. Like the forest that Portland is in and a part of. What do you think was here before Portland was here? Forest, exactly. This land loves to grow trees. It's what it's super good at. And it has grown trees before us, it will grow trees after us. Right now, we're just in this time that there is a city plopped down in this forest. So there's an urban forest, and the more forest we have, the more resilient we are to climate change, just like all the critters in the big woods. So those are kind of the three things that we look at in terms of the intersection between forest management and climate change. And then within that, 350, we have to focus a little bit, because those are big issue areas, like the intersection between climate justice and at 350 PDX, we're volunteer driven. So when I say we, I'm referring to our forest defense team, who's a group of very committed volunteers like Harriet and our two Scots. You want to wave, Scots? So them and a lot of other people who help hold this all together. And our main focuses are to move public forest management toward recognizing the value of carbon sequestration and carbon storage. It's just as important, if not more important, than industrial forest production. And that is a big shift, because for the last 150 years, the forests in Oregon have been really managed. With that, it's the wonkiest part of what we do, because there's a lot of plans with a lot of acronyms. The state forests, they're working on a habitat conservation plan to protect endangered species, which just very narrowly got approved by the Board of Forestry after a long campaign by a lot of environmental advocates. And strangely, the state itself, the Oregon Department of Forestry, was actually on the right side of it, maybe for the first time ever. And so that was great. But there's a second big wonky plan coming out called the Forest Management Plan for the state forests. And these are the forests like the Clatsop and Tillamook forests, the Coast Range that you drive through on your way to the coast and you say, oh my goodness, look at all those clear cuts. Those are the forests that we're working on. So we're working on state forest management, and also federal forest management cannot be ignored right now. These are the large forests that run down the Cascades from Canada down all the way to Southern California are national forests. They encompass an enormous amount of land. Our closest is Mount Hood National Forest. And right now, the 18 national forests that are covered by the Northwest Forest Plan. Did you talk about the Northwest Forest Plan? Okay, very, very briefly, it's a plan, it just celebrated its 30th birthday, that came out of the Clinton administration to try and resolve the timber wars by creating more compromise between species management and timber production. It's better than not having it, but it's going through, right? Would you say that, Chuck? Better than it not existing? Yeah. So it's not the best, but it also really helped shift towards looking at whole ecosystems, and it's going through its first ever major amendment. So whatever happens in the Northwest Forest Plan Amendment will affect 18 national forests, which is a pretty cool way to make a lot of change happen all at once. There's also, the Biden administration is moving forward with a mature and old growth logging rule, where we're saying, how about you don't log it? How about that's the rule? Just like a flat moratorium on logging mature and old growth trees. And there's a lot of momentum around that. And if you're interested in those things, there will be a week of action, the week of June 10th, with a big rally in Portland at the U.S. Forest Service Region 6 headquarters, specifically to say, manage the forest for climate, for species, for common sense, and not for increased timber production. So that's one thing we're working on, public lands. Second thing is making a more equitable urban forest. Another question, who was here in the summer of 2021? June 2021. Anyone remember? What happened in June 2021? It was hot. How hot was it?
116 degrees.
If you lived in a shady neighborhood, it was 116 degrees. In Lentz, exactly, the hottest part of Portland came in at 124 degrees. It was the deadliest natural event we've ever had in Portland, right? And why were some places 116 and the others 124?
Trees.
Trees. Absolutely 100% trees. Portland has the biggest disparity in trees and heat of any city in the country. So we have a very unequitably distributed urban forest. I live in the Southwest. Many of you, I'm guessing, are also West Siders. We've got the trees over here. It's pretty treey. But along the east side, there's a huge inequity of who has the trees and who has the heat islands. So some of the work we're doing with other awesome urban tree advocates, I see Bruce. Bruce, can you wave? Bruce is an amazing urban tree advocate on the Urban Forest Commission. And we've been working to create a more equitably distributed canopy. And that's through advocating for the city to do something that you think they already would do, which is pay for the maintenance of street trees, right? They are public assets, all those street trees. And the responsibility for paying for them falls on the adjacent landowner. So imagine if you're already having a hard time meeting your rent, buying your groceries, paying your bills, and the city comes around and says, hey, have this free tree, right? We'll put this free tree in the parking strip because trees are great. They'll give you shade, they'll give that. But you're going to be responsible for all of the arborist bills. You'll be responsible for its upkeep. If there's an ice storm and half of it falls, you are responsible for cleaning it up. Might you be a little hesitant to take that tree, right? That has been seen as the biggest barrier to creating a more equitable forest, is the fact that people are expected to pay for the city assets of street trees. So we're working to change that and are getting closer. And also there is a new urban forest plan happening. They have a survey right now saying, what would you like your urban forest to be? So it's a good thing if you are interested in letting your, how to say, I want to be generous to this survey. It's a little shallow, but there are places where you can write in things, because it's basically like, are trees good? You like check, yes. But then it says, please tell me more, and you can tell them more. So if you're interested in telling urban forestry more about what you think should happen, go to the Portland's urban forest page, take the survey, let them know that having an equitably distributed canopy or whatever else you want to tell them about urban forests is a good thing. And I'll wrap up quickly. One other thing we're focused on right now is stopping false climate solutions from gaining traction. And as you all know, in a crisis, capitalists usually like to take advantage of people's worry and fear and say, it's okay, just we'll do this thing and buy it and make ourselves money and a lot of profit, and usually doesn't make things better. So that's happening right now around in the energy sector in a lot of different ways, but bioenergy is a big one that's being promoted, and we're looking at industrial scale biomass energy production plants coming into the Northwest and California and making pellets out of trees to be shipped across the seas, either to Europe or to Asia, where they are burned, co-fired in coal plants and called renewable energy. So this is truly a thing that's truly happening. And the companies are getting subsidized billions of dollars by ratepayers to help meet clean energy targets. The whole thing is such a scam. Even the company sounds like an evil villain. It's called Drax. It's coming from England. Was England's largest coal burner. Now it's England's largest wood burner, and they're trying to expand their fiber basket in the Northwest. They've proposed a plant that would make use 1 million tons of wood per year to make pellets to ship overseas, and we're trying to stop that plant. No one has successfully stopped Drax from coming into their communities yet. But this is the thin green line. We have a reputation to upkeep of stopping bad energy export plants. This one just happens to be tree energy. And so if you're interested in helping us stop that, we're working with a lot of people in Washington State. I mean, Longview's just across the river, and they'd be looking at our trees as well as Washington's trees. And once they're there, they don't only use trees, but as any community that has a Drax pellet plant there says, it's just horrible. It's loud, it's air pollution, they're a bad neighbor, like the whole thing is so many layers of bad. So usually forest people don't get to fight big energy companies. That's like what our fossil fuel side does. So the fighter in me is kind of excited. I'm like, oh yeah, Drax, like you come, we're gonna kick you out. But then the person who really wants to be focused on positive solutions can't believe it. I'm like, really? We have to fight another really bad idea. But we do, and hopefully we'll win quickly, and they'll go away. So those are some of the things we're working on at the intersection of climate justice and forest management. And 350 generally works on, like I said, bioenergy issues in terms, and other fossil fuel energy with Zenith and the critical energy infrastructure hub. We're also getting our hands like deep into this Portland election to try and make climate justice an important piece of the dialogue between the candidates in this election. If you're interested in any of that, or if you want a yard sign, our Southwest team is a bunch of yard signs that they're giving out that say climate justice now. Visit the table up there. I'm going to quiet myself so Chuck can come up, but then hopefully we'll have some discussion and questions afterwards.
Thank you, Brenna. I'm always inspired by your words, and I couldn't capture them. So at the 350 table, you can find out more of these details. There also is an action night once a month. It's on Wednesday nights. Remember which one? Third Wednesday night, and it's at the headquarters of 350 PDX off of Mississippi. And all that information is available at the table. And we can go every month and get the update. What kind of actions are needed now? How can we help now? One of the things that 350 did related to the bioenergy baloney was they hosted the film Burned. It's available online. I can't recommend it enough. To see what this company does. They say, oh, we just take the little branches, the twigs and the leaves, and that's all that we do. The stuff that's just going to get thrown away, the stuff that we need to go into the earth and to build soil. But they say no, they go in and they clear cut. They clear cut, they clear cut. There's pictures of it. So the film Burned. So thank you again, Brenna. Our final speaker is Chuck Willer. And Chuck has been working in Oregon coastal forest conservation for over 30 years. During this time, he's been director or co-director of the Coast Range Association, which was founded in 1990 to help protect, conserve, and restore Oregon coastal forests. The CRA has received numerous awards, and they were actually invited to the President Clinton 1993 Forest Summit in Portland. And this is the work that helped develop the Northwest Forest Plan. Their work helps protect federal and state forests, contributed to the adoption of the Northwest Forest Plan, and they continue to defend and improve this plan. Well, I think we're going to hear a little bit more about that. I also want to give you a heads up to the Dayenu table, which is on this wall of walls over in the corner. There are these postcards, and we're encouraged to write to our governmental officials and Tina Kotek about where we want the Inflation Reduction Act monies to go. So maybe, what that? Not to subsidize biomass, but there are places, so maybe Chuck can give us some ideas about that. Since 2016, Chuck has been speaking and writing about Oregon's private industrial forests and how their ownership has shifted to Wall Street real estate investment trusts. The goal of these corporate-owned forests is to make the most money quickly for shareholders with no regard for biodiversity, carbon sequestration, water quality, and keeping salmon populations from extinction. In 2021, Chuck wrote the CRA's groundbreaking report, Climate and Oregon's Industrial Forests, a Green New Deal Proposal. In 2023, he authored Wealth, Income, and Oregon's Rural Communities. The CRA is a vital part of the Pacific Northwest Forest Climate Alliance, which was formed to challenge Wall Street forest ownership and oppose the greenwashing efforts of the timber industry. I encourage everyone to make the time to visit the Coast Range Association website and listen to some of the radio podcasts. For today's short panel, Chuck and Brenna are helping us focus on the actions we can do at this time to help support their efforts in protecting forests. So I want to welcome Chuck, who's going to tell us a little bit more about the Coast Range Association and where they're at right now with their fight against these industrial nightmares.
Order. Okay, I'm good. I guess I ought to speak near the microphone. I don't generally need microphones. Having grown up in Chicago, I know how to talk loud. In any case, once again, I have to follow Brenna Bell. I hate that. because she's articulate and knowledgeable. And then I've got to talk. So all I'm going to do is briefly touch base on where our story has gone. Starting, as Harriet indicated, 2016, I started focusing on Wall Street-owned forestry. Okay? So let me just state that since that time and currently, there's two phenomena that are overarching and influence everything I think about and our organization thinks about, and that is the climate crisis and the extinction crisis. And we started out actually with the Reed-Noss Biodiversity Plan in 1993. So we've been focused and sensitive to the conservation of biological diversity for the past 30 years. And the Coast Range forest, if you look at all the forest above the Siskiyous and west of the Cascades, about 40% public ownership, 80% and 60% private. Of the private ownership, it's about 80% industrial. Those are the Wall Street financial forests. And so what I've been researching, and I've been doing this for 25 years actually, and arguing with OSU economists and others that like to give a business perspective to things. I look and argue with Wall Street ownership, but I'm really talking about financial management of forests. And all corporate owners currently in the Coast Range, almost all, I can name a couple that don't, manage on a financial basis. Now, I'm not going to get into what that means, because that's a big story. But in 2016 to 2020, I kept drilling into that kind of management. We did ownership maps. They're available on the Coast Range website, where we actually identified every single forest parcel that's owned by these kinds of entities. We looked at tax avoidance and raised the red flag on the massive change in taxation on property, and how with the rise of real estate investment trusts, the Oregon legislature just decided to lower property taxes on these guys. Imagine that. And explained and drilled into corporate financial management, and as Harriet indicated, let me just stop here. So this was an early map we did where we showed forest ownership. In Western Oregon, the red lands are explicitly owned by real estate investment trust or timber investment management organizations, but they all manage on a financial basis. So this was one of our first products, and we have a more spiffy product of the map we came out with in 2020. We ended up then, as Harriet talked about, the Follow the Money report, and also a population analysis of Western Oregon. And we do these kinds of things where we look at, here's where we looked at population change between 1990 and 2020. The red areas are areas that lost population. Can you imagine 30 years in Oregon where the population growth was 49%? These red areas lost population, and the, I don't know what, orangish color was less than half of Oregon's average population growth. This is the abandonment of rural lands, the abandonment of an economic policy for rural lands, and the loss of population, and the growing pissed offness of rural people. Now, that regime started with Ronald Reagan, and it's called austerity. This grinding down on one part of the people and the economy, and the lifting up of another part, which also happens to be concentrated in a few urban areas. There's a book that recently came out that was original research on the economists pushing austerity policy post-World War I. This is new, shocking, original research by Claire Mattei at the New School in New York, and how that regime laid the basis and explicitly worked with the rise of fascism in Italy and Western Europe. And we're seeing the same thing being repeated in Western countries that have adopted heavy austerity policies, grind down on the working class, and you see the rise of fascist tendencies again. And this is the book, and this is an important book, and it will be part of my story in terms of this story arc. And lastly, and this is just brief, how many people are familiar with post-Keynesian economics? Okay, we got two. Anybody heterodox economics under that rubric? And institutional economics, which goes back to Weber, but has got some current nifty little things. Well, what I've done in the past couple of years, past 10 years, maybe even longer than that, I've been drilling into economics because that's where the BS starts. The BS to grind on people and support capital and corporate interest in the billionaire class. And I've come up and I've put together the last story installment and story arc of my Wall Street story agenda, a description of the capitalist dynamic and economy that is owning our forest, buying our homes, invading, and it has invaded healthcare, invaded schools, invaded prisons, and is invading all aspects of our life. And I have my slideshow, current version, explains this dynamic, the institutional structures, the dynamics, and how it's into everyone's business. And this is a slide. This is my model. This is kind of a heterodox model of the economy, the political economy. And what I describe and talk about, and these are the four parts of that model. I really talk about what I call the capitalist power core. That's money creation with the foundation in the central bank, the banks, money creation, and then private equity investment and the index funds, passive investment. This dynamic here is the thing that's driving this whole system. And we also look at, as part of this, and this is a Coast Range perspective, I've never heard anyone else talk about it, the distribution of income then within the population and how this plays out in policy and politics. So a study just came out looking at blue collar, the 50% of the workforce that's blue collar by their definition, and how 6 states have now one legislature from that part of the population. They're like Alabama, South Carolina, this, that, and Oregon. Every single legislature in Oregon comes from the professional and more affluent classes. And then you've got the really affluent, and you've got the 1%, the 1/10 of 1%, and that kind of stuff. It's really important to understand how the wealth distribution, the power distribution, and the dynamic of capital and the capitalist system works to create the politics that ends up grinding down on people and not helping and not really making things better, and driving, from my perspective, and really what I'm paid for, driving the bio-extinction crisis and the climate crisis. So that's all I had to say, and what I would say is that I'd be happy to do a webinar again with folks here at the Climate Action Group, whatever, and complete the story arc.
Thank you, Chuck. I'm going to just take a minute to lift up another book on economics called donut economics. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of it. There are other models of economics. Donut economics is not about how to make money making donuts. It looks like a donut. The outer circle is the maximum human activity for the sustainability and the health of the planet. And the inner circle is the minimum requirements for human health and thriving. And Kate Raworth says, all human activity has to exist within the donut. So that's a very brief overview of an excellent book on an alternative model that we need to be thinking about. We have a few minutes for Q&A, and I'm going to go back to this Dayenu postcard, because what Chuck was talking about with, you know, the capitalist reality and his 2021 report on the Green New Deal, one of the things that defines the New Deal is, where do we put money? Where do we put government money to help support the things, the activities that are vital? So in the original New Deal, there was a lot of infrastructure. The Green New Deal is, what is the living infrastructure? And so I'm going to throw the first question. Yeah, we don't have a hard stop on the time, so we are at 2 o'clock for those that want to leave. I want to ask any of our speakers if they'd like to contribute to, where should we be writing to Tina Kotek and our legislators and saying, this is where we need to invest some of that Inflation Reduction Act money, which is code word for Green New Deal money. But we're not allowed to say that, because then it wouldn't have gotten voted for. But everybody wants inflation reduction, so we have the Inflation Reduction Act. So I would like to invite any of you to come up and share where you think we should be requesting that money go. And then I want to invite whoever is here, just raise your hand if you have a question.
I have several ideas, but I'll focus on one thing that I didn't talk about because it's so important, and that is fire preparedness. So we are in a time of warming. It is not totally unnatural. We've had a lot of large fires in our history. What we didn't have in the history, though, is that many people living in areas that were in danger of burning. And the way the government is approaching it, federal and state, is two bad ideas. Bad idea number one, let's just pretend we can put out all the fires. Because the big fires, the fires that do the most damage to our infrastructure, are wind-driven events. They are weather systems. You cannot put out a weather system, right? You can put out little fires, but not big ones. So they're like, okay, well, let's go log the forest, and that will affect the way the fire moves. Also not applicable to the large fires that are driven by weather. So the two solutions that they have, put them out or log to change the fuel behavior, only work for small fires. So what does that mean for us? That means we cannot log our way out or stop the fire by management. So the thing we can do is what people who live in tornado zones do, who live in hurricane zones or earthquake zones. They prepare, right? What we need to do is put money into fire preparedness. And that is the thing that gets the least amount of money from the state right now, and the least amount of money from the federal government. And it came up in the last legislative session. There was a bill that Elizabeth Steiner brought forward that would decrease the amount that the timber companies that Chuck was just talking about, these TIMOs and REITs, have to pay in taxes, and increase the amount that all of the rest of the Oregonians would have to pay in taxes to fight fires, to have money to fight fires. That's a bad idea. What we would like to see is more of the money that's coming in from the IRA go to communities to do home hardening, which is making your home more resilient to a fire, to create community preparedness systems, to create shelter and evac systems. All these things we can do because we know there are going to be more big fires. They're just going to happen. Like we have to make our peace with that. We are in a new era of fire weather events, and putting money into helping communities be resilient to those, deal with them, rebuild when they're, after they happen, would be a really sensible use of the money. And to try and shift it towards more logging or more fire prevention just will not address the ones that are actually the crisis. That's one thing. Yeah.
That was great. That was really, really, you mentioned the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. There's $3.5 billion in that federal fund for thinning forests. And as Brenda mentioned, worst thing you can do, pretty much. We're thinning forests to prevent forest fire. Doesn't make any sense. Doesn't stop the forest burning. I mean, the problem, we don't have enough fire in our forests. We hear so much, we have too much fire. Now, we have not enough fire in our forests. We have too many people who live near the forest who are not prepared to withstand what the forest can do to their home. We need, as Brenda said, we need to harden our homes. If the Forest Service were to put that money towards hardening, we'd be better off. So,
I have one more question, sorry. And then we'll take questions from the audience. One of the solutions that we need to figure out how we can finance is longer rotations. Right now, they are cutting trees at 40 years, maybe 50, but not too many. They don't, 20. At 20, they're still net emitters. And at 40, they're just starting their sequestration, their significant sequestration. And so, has there been anybody who's talking about how can we help subsidize with some of this money good forest management practices? These, particularly the small forest owners who are managing their forests in a sustainable way with these longer rotations.
Well, that's something I've been talking about for a few years, It is the basis of the Green New Deal proposal, which is our argument is land reform based on the money from a Green New Deal. I would roll back to the Tina Kotek question. Two thoughts. The state of Oregon's political leaders and the state do not talk at the scale of money that as it at all corresponds to the crises we face. There's a big difference between $1 billion and $1 trillion. And I get Merkley's newsletters and he'll crow about he's got 20 million for some project or something. 20 million, million, billion, trillion. The Inflation Reduction Act was what, about $500 billion? It's $500 billion. People do not understand the scale of the money needed to transform forests and everything else we need to transform. So it would be very good if we had leadership that was educating the public about how the world works. Money-wise, who has the money, where to get the money, etc. Like a lot of politicians in the old used to do. Instead of polling to find out what to say to people because they want to hear it. We're beyond telling people what they want to hear. We have to be leaders and tell people what they need to hear. And how the world works in money between the federal government and the state government should be explained. The federal government creates money with the Federal Reserve and banks. The states do not create money. If they have money, if they need money in excess of their budget, their income, they have to borrow money. How the system works should be explained. And the realities of scale need to be explained. And it's way over my pay grade. This is something for governors, senators, and congressional delegation to go to the public and tell them the hard truths. Easy for me to say.
Any other questions about our forests? Scott?
Yeah, a question for Chuck. It really feels like that there needs to be a changing of hearts and minds in the rural communities about their loyalty to timber companies. How is your message being received in the rural communities?
That's the question I was hoping for.
So the question was, how is Chuck's message being received in rural communities?
Well, the message isn't being received in rural communities because that's a big scale. But I am talking to people in rural areas about this message of we have more in common than we have, whatever you imagine you don't like about somebody, imagine how many things you do have in common if you appreciate some issues. And I mean, I've had right-wing leaders and stuff call me up and start telling me about something, and I'll go, what are we going to do about Wall Street and the billionaires owning everything? And they'll get right on your program and start talking. They got a bigger issues with that, but then they'll float. Well, what about the Mexicans? They'll float off on these issues that have been created to divide us. You have to pull them back to the fundamental thing of what is it that you need? Do you need a college education for your kids? What about the house you're living in that's really so run down? You can just drive through any of the rural areas. Would you like a better house? How do you get a better house? How do you get nice windows that don't let the heat out? You talk to people about what do we have in common? And you'd be shocked at how easy it is to have a conversation. And here's the good news, is that I'm working with a younger set of activists who grew up. Maybe they're kind of gone local, but they had maybe a hippie parent. And I'll tell you, they get right along with the loggers, and they know about Wall Street and the ripoff. And they're going, we really like what you have to say. And I think we have to put together, and what I'm working on is a network of voices and leaders that will bring this message to rural valleys and little towns. That's it.
I just wanted to ask you a question about job security, and I don't know too much about this for real, but I'm just imagining that in logging communities, that is the major source of income, and that I don't know how many rural communities are sustained by logging, but is there some mechanism in place so that if people decide to get on board, there's another income source for them to have that will give them purpose and a living wage? Because that also figures into changing the scenario, yeah?
We did a whole report, I think, in 2015. I got Autobahn to pay for it in Portland, and Paul Swadine to write it about what really makes, how income happens in the rural and the counties. And logging has nothing to do with rural income. There's no income that comes out of logging, hardly at all. I mean, you've got a big harvester, you've got all this big equipment, those are on lease payments. The cash flow from the sale of the timber is going to Wall Street lease payments, banks. The few loggers that are running these machines, they make a good pay, but it means nothing in the local economy. And then of the timber companies, and the modern timber company, the actual blue-collar logger, half of them live in the cities. They're very mobile. They make a good buck. They want their kids to go to Corvallis High. They don't want their kids to go to Alsea High. So, you know, they're living where the money is. And then the timber companies and the mill companies now, and the nature of the modern world, technicals, professionals, and managers take a huge amount of the wage income. You know, in a lumber mill, somebody on the green chain makes 40 grand, 45 grand. A technical doing software or a manager is going to be making $140,000 to $160,000. It's just the nature of employment under austerity and the corporate power complex.
Years ago, timber companies were family-owned,
Yeah.
and they were part of the community. These new guys, Naveen, whatever, they're, as you say, in Wall Street. What are their connections?
Here's a funny thing about ownership is the question is, what about the old days that there were like family owners? I mean, you could go talk to a Ford family member owning Roseburg Forest Products and running Douglas County. And not anymore. You don't see any of these people. And in fact, with private equity now, you don't really know who owns any company. It could be Roseburg Forest Products, but we don't know if they've got European capital invested in them. You don't know who owns them, and that's called the beneficial owners of anything. It's all blind. And Sohn family, down in Roseburg, they owned what was their company? They own a mill and they own 150,000 acres in a mill. Well, they brag on their website now that the foreign investors are very impressed with the return they're getting. You thought it was the Sohn family. Well, no. It's the invisible ownership. And this is, you know, I thought back in the 70s I understood how capitalism worked, you know, the companies and this and that, Wall Street. There's a whole new world out there of institutions and mechanisms and way things are flowing I really wasn't paying attention to until I did some research starting a couple of years ago. I mean, these guys have got a big thing going.
I want to highlight two things out of what Chuck said. One is that in the state of Oregon, the entire timber economy is about 2.5% of our state's GDP. So people often think of Oregon as this place that's really heavily invested and dependent on the timber economy, and it once was, but it isn't anymore. They still have an outsized influence in politics, but their actual participation in the GDP is very small. And then the other is there's been a massive loss of jobs while volume logged has been increasing. And that's completely, like Chuck said, due to mechanization. And I just wanted to like pop that out because I think a lot of people think, oh, less logging means less jobs and less jobs means economic downturn and that's sad. But actually less jobs now is solely due to mechanization. And we can increase the logging actually. The jobs and volume graph has changed now. So logging increases, jobs are still going down. I mean, one way to deal with that is get big machines out of the woods. It would be better for the environment and it would employ more people, but the people not making the profit would be the shareholders.
Thank you. We have a big problem. We don't have all the answers. Paul Koberstein's book covers a lot of territory. It gives us the background so that we can go out there and we can have intelligent conversations and we can participate in helping to revision, like, how can we be involved in restructuring society so that we are valuing these forests that are how we're going to survive the climate crisis. So on that note, I want to give a big thank you to Brenna, Chuck, and Paul. And thank you to everybody who showed up for the talk today.